Okay, Shiloh. I have an acquaintance at Lindenwood University who would tell you that used to be the head of chair of history there. Will tell you that the Battle of Shiloh, the South could not have won the Civil War after Shiloh. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that's his opinion. But that gives you an idea of how important to the Civil War the Battle of Shiloh was. We had Fort Donelson and Fort Henry last month. Afterwards, General Johnston concentrates all available Confederate forces in the West. He's forced to retreat from Bowling Green to Nashville, and then after Fort Donelson's defeated, he has to evacuate Nashville, and then they move all the way down to Corinth. Corinth is selected as the concentration point for the Confederate Army because it is the junction of the Mobile and Ohio and the Memphis and Charleston railroads. It's one of the most important rail junctions in the South. General Polk's army from Columbus, the Gibraltar of the West that was never tested because that position was outflanked at Henry and Donelson, they also retreat to Corinth. A division under Daniel Ruggles comes up from Mississippi, and a large group from Florida and Alabama under Braxton Bragg come up from the south, and they will all concentrate at Corinth. For the Union, they know that these guys are there, and they want to get at the Army, Confederate Army, and they want to cut that railroad, one of the most important railroad junctions in the South. They want to cut it. So after Fort Henry and Donelson, General Henry Halleck, who's commander in the West, comes from St. Louis to the Army in the field, and they begin to march from Fort Henry, not march, they go by, so Henry Halleck comes to Fort Henry, and by steamboat, the Army travels upstream, south, to find a landing on the Tennessee River where they can get to Corinth. Don Carlos Buell's army, which has been messing around up in Kentucky for months, Buell can't seem to move. All of a sudden, Grant takes Forts Henry and Donelson, and Buell decides, wait a minute, the war's passing me by. So all of a sudden, he can march. So he marches south to Bowling Green, and eventually he is ordered to march to Savannah, which is going to be where the Union headquarters is. The Union chooses Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River as the point of concentration. It is, we will look at a better picture later, but it is high ground in a fairly swampy area around the Tennessee River. There's a landing there, and it is the most direct route from the Tennessee River, where these guys are moving on steamboats, to Corinth. And William Sherman, interesting enough, is the guy who recommends the concentration. The commanders, Ulysses S. Grant for the Union, Albert Sidney Johnston for the Confederates. So this is what Pittsburgh, an aerial view of Pittsburgh Landing. You have the Tennessee River, swampy ground on either side, some large creeks, which are low and swampy, and then you have in the middle this high ground, almost a plateau, if you will, in the kind of the level, low landscape of West Tennessee. It's bisected by a few creeks, which have significant drainages, but for the most part, if any of you have ever been to Shiloh, it's really flat up on top of that kind of plateau area. So it's close to the river. It's on the most direct route from the Tennessee River to Corinth, and there's a lot of camping space there because once again, you're talking over 30,000 Union troops. That's a lot of troops. So this was the best area for a campsite. So that's why you wonder why Shiloh, of all places, literally in the middle of nowhere. That's why this is selected. The Union has 6 divisions in their army, the Army of Tennessee. Now, Buell hasn't arrived yet. He's en route, but he's not there. The Army of the Tennessee has 5 divisions. William Wallace's, Stephen Hurlbut's, John McClernand, William Sherman, Benjamin Prentiss. And one of Sherman's brigades, one of his 3 brigades, is actually put way out here on the southeast flank, the left flank of the Union Army. And this brigade is going to be extremely significant in how the battle develops. As in Fort Donelson, if you remember, the troops were not entrenched when they were at Fort Donelson, and the Confederates were able to roll up the Union right flank because there was no defenses there. Same thing here. The Union does not choose to dig in. Grant believes it gives them an overly defensive posture, so he doesn't want them digging in. And plus, they're going to, as soon as Halleck gets here, as soon as Buell gets rise in a few days, they're going to leave. So why do they need to entrench? Plus, Grant is under orders not to bring on a general engagement. Grant, after Fort Donelson and Henry, was temporarily relieved by Henry Halleck because under the ridiculous made-up excuse that he left his area of responsibility. So Grant is extremely sensitive right now to Halleck's wishes, so he is not going to do anything to upset the general-in-chief. So the result of that is reconnaissance is very weak on the part of the Union. They're not out scouting miles and miles in front of their position. Grant's keeping a tight hold on his troops. Sherman is the senior officer here. He is basically the camp commander. Grant spends most of his time during the evenings in Savannah, which is about 7 miles downstream or north. And the reason is because that's where the telegraph is. Because Halleck is a micromanager, and Halleck wants to hear reports all the time. So Grant needs to be where he can be at the telegraph as much as possible. So his headquarters boat, the Tigris, goes back and forth every day from the camp to the Cherry House in Savannah, where his headquarters is, and the Cherry House is still there, right near the ferry landing, on the ferry across the river. It's still there.
Hey, Doug?
Yeah.
When did General Smith die?
He died after the Battle of Shiloh.
He died after?
Charles Smith was a regular Army officer. If you remember last month, he commanded one of the divisions at Fort Donelson. When Grant is temporarily relieved of command, Smith is given charge of the Army. Smith skins his ankle in a ridiculous, silly accident. It gets infected and he later dies. I mean, it's something that nobody would die of today.
Well, Grant respected too.
Everybody respected Smith. In fact, a lot of people thought he should be the commander instead of Grant. So yeah, Smith, he's alive. He's alive at the battle, and he dies several days after the battle in the Cherry Mansion.
Yeah, but Smith didn't hold that opinion. He didn't want it.
No, Smith, well, he was apparently was really a super guy and a very professional officer. He never complained about it. He was glad just to be in the fight after all those years. So not a lot of activity. He's finally in the fight. He's a general. He's happy. He made Grant and the other young division commanders made their jobs a whole lot easier by his attitude of accepting his position. I just threw this in here to show you what when the battle starts. Normally you have regiment is the building block of a Civil War army. You have regiments put in brigades and divisions and then corps. At Shiloh, the division on the Confederate side, the division organization goes away, and basically they're fighting as brigades. So we don't even really talk about divisions. There's like 16 infantry brigades at Shiloh, and that's how kind of we're going to track the battle. And on the Union side, there's no corps. The divisions, there's 6 divisions, and they report directly to General Grant. This is what the Army of the Tennessee looks like. These are the commanders. None of these guys are professional soldiers. Sherman's a military academy graduate, was a professional soldier. None of these other guys are. Breckinridge, of course, was the former vice president. Hardee and Bragg are professional soldiers. Polk is a graduate of the military academy. So the Confederate plan is that they will march from Corinth. They're going to leave on the 3rd of April, 1862. It's about a 22 mile march. They're going to march most of the way to a store called Mickey's, and they're going to rendezvous there a few miles from the battlefield, and then on the 4th, they are going to, I said the 4th, the 3rd, they leave on the 3rd, they're going to attack on the 4th. The plan is to attack on the Union left flank, to drive the Union Army away from Pittsburgh Landing, and then swing to the left, crush the Army against the Tennessee River and the swampy ground around Snake and Owl Creek to the north of there. This is the guy that developed the plan. He is the chief of staff on General Beauregard's staff. Beauregard is the second in command next to Albert Sidney Johnston. He's the guy he's later a general. He's the guy that comes up with the plan, and he comes in for a lot of grief in the years after the war. The Confederates believed that the Union left flank was 1 mile south of Pittsburgh Landing. They needed to drive the Union Army 1 mile to the south. That was based on map reconnaissance and human reconnaissance. It was not based on actual sending out cavalry to scout the positions. They did not have eyes on the Union position until the very start of the battle.
Doug, what was Jordan's background that he was put in a position to come up with the plan?
I think he was a professional soldier. I'll have to look it up, but I think he was. Somebody look it up real quick if you want to. But I think he was a professional soldier before the war. The Confederates advance on two roads, which is good. Unlike the Russians in Ukraine would try to advance on one road and got smoked. They advance on 2 axes, and they were supposed to rendezvous at Mitchie, so you can see it's most of the way there. The weather was terrible, rained, so it's hard to get artillery, it's hard to get wagons, supply wagons through there. In addition, this is the first time these guys have ever really they've retreated before, but this is the first time they've ever had to really make an advance on an enemy position in an organized manner, and they completely failed. What they needed was military police there, because the order of march got screwed up. Units got mixed up because a unit would cut off another unit that wasn't supposed to be marching yet. Units, when you advance, you go in a certain order, and there's a reason you go in that order. To make the flow of the advance better, you have supply at a certain place, you have cavalry out front, you have your slower moving stuff at the rear. That didn't happen here. Polk's corps, for example, cut off one of the other corps, cut off Hardee's corps, got ahead, slowed him down. It's a mess. So instead of taking 1 day to get to Mickey's, they don't arrive until the 5th. It's basically the 3rd, the 4th, and the 5th. It basically takes them 3 days, and they had planned to get there in 1 day. So they're afraid that when they get there, the Union Army's going to know, because they're making noise, and it's just a disaster of a march. But General Johnston decides that he doesn't care. This is it. This is the big push. This is the big battle that's going to restore the strategic situation in the West, so we're going to attack. So here's the actual tactical plan of attack. Hardee's corps is going to attack on line. A couple thousand yards behind them is Bragg's Corps on line. Polk's Corps follows. They are in a column of brigade or in a column of divisions, and then they'll spread out once they get close to the battlefield. Yes.
Are they on a horse or are they?
No, they're dismounted. They're walking.
They're walking.
Yes.
Okay. And where's their artillery?
It's each corps has its own artillery.
Okay.
There is at this point, and that's a good question. Later in the war, particularly in the Union Army does a better job of organizing their artillery. Artilleries will be kept in corps, in big organizations, and the commanders can put it where they need it. At this time, you have artillery all the way down in brigades. So they're really in direct support of small units. So it's not particularly flexible. The Confederates don't do as good a job as the Union does at basically reorganizing it. So now almost all these guys, brigades, 1,000 to 3,000 man brigade is going to have an artillery battery. There is really, and that brings up a good point, because we'll see how it would have been easier for the Confederates to use artillery in the battle a little later here. So these corps, they're about a mile wide. The front is, and it's just one group. One individual, Hardee, commands this whole line. So, any tactical geniuses in here? What's wrong with that particular formation? What is the typical formation when you go into battle?
Column.
Column?
Or maybe more of a tactical column where you're like 2 up, or 3 up and 1 back, or 2 up and 2 back.
But do you generally have an entire corps on line, like one
No.
person controlling the whole battlefield?
No.
Right can't see the left, and they have the terrain.
You have sectors. You would have one person have this sector, one person have this sector. So the front is controllable. Here, it's impossible for one person to control a formation a mile wide. So the plan is bad from the start.
Thanks for acknowledging my tactical genius, by the way.
So the battle starts. Hardee's line, it takes them forever. Before dawn, they're out there trying to get organized, but it's dark. They've never done this before. And they have to make this, march up and then make this super long line. So it takes them forever to get it done. While they're doing that, one of the brigade commanders in the Union Army, Everett Peabody, the mayor of St. Joseph, Missouri, a guy captured at Lexington earlier in the war, the year before, he's getting really nervous. And against orders, he sends out what's now called the Dawn Patrol. They leave their camp. They head out on this road. It's basically a farm road. It's called Reconnoitering Road today at Shiloh. And they enter an old cotton field owned by a guy named Fraley. They enter the field through the woods, and there's mist on the ground. It's just beginning to get light. The mist clears, and the sun comes up. And what do they see across this field? They see thousands and thousands and thousands of Confederate troops lined up. There's one Mississippi battalion that's kind of in the middle of the field, kind of screening in front. They start a firefight, and at 4:50 a.m., the Battle of Shiloh begins. The Confederates eventually attack. They get Hardee gets his line organized, then they attack, and they begin driving the Federals back. Initially, they retreat to Say Field, the far side of this cotton field. Then they retreat to this high ground in the woods, and finally, they're driven back to their brigade camp. The Confederates attack this position. Now there's way more Confederates in that front line, and it's a mile long. Some of them will go to the left and will eventually attack Sherman. Others will go to the right and go to another Union brigade on the other side over here. These maps here, these overall maps, they show you the entire battlefield, and this is the area that we're looking at right now, and it'll show you what's going on across the whole battlefield at this particular point in time. And what we're going to look at is right here. Here's where the first fighting was. Prentice's brigade is driven back to their brigade camp. Kind of about this same time, Sherman is attacked for the first time. And shortly thereafter, Union troops begin moving to the front. They said there's 5 divisions there. There's also another division up at a place called Crump's Landing, about 5 or 6 miles north, that commanded by Lew Wallace, and they can't camp here because there's not enough room. So they're left farther north. So you got 5 divisions. The divisions that are not attacked on their own initiative before Grant can arrive on the battlefield, they begin to march toward the front. This was in that area, pinked-in area. 3 Confederate brigades attacked Prentice's 2 brigades. This is level ground. It's not really defensible terrain. It's just kind of open. And Peabody's brigade is routed. Peabody is killed. There's a monument to him at Shiloh. This other brigade, commanded by Madison Miller, who was the mayor of Carondelet before the war. Gladden's brigade, Confederate brigade, attacks up the Eastern Corinth Road and eventually turns their flank. And very early in the morning, one entire division of the 6 on the battlefield, or the 5 on the battlefield, are driven away.
Prentice only had 2 brigades?
Yes. So this was Peabody here. This was Prentice here. Yes.
I didn't know if it might, I don't know if you consider this important enough to interject, but just for everybody to know too, that 2/3 of the Union Army didn't even know they were fighting for over 2 hours. I mean, the engagement was happening down there, and they knew something was going on, but they really did not have a clue that they were engaged. First Smith.
So these troops that are attacking here, the Confederates, they were from the first line. Now from the second line, from Bragg's troops, you begin getting more Confederates coming up, and they're moving around to the right. These guys have been defeated. Now you have Confederate more troops moving to the right. All right, this just kind of shows, once again, this Gladden is from the first rank of Confederates, from Hardee's, and Chalmers is from Bragg, the second line. And so now you can see now they're already, these troops are already becoming commingled, and the battle has just barely started. Grant is in breakfast at Shiloh. One of his staff officers hears the guns at Shiloh. So Grant goes and listens. He orders the steam built up on his headquarters boat, the Tigris, and he prepares to head to the front. He does have a word with General Smith before he leaves. The Union divisions that were in the rear, most of them on their own initiative, begin to move to the front before Grant arrives. When Grant's steamboat is ready to go, he stops at Crump's Landing and he tells Lew Wallace to march to the battlefield. There are differences of opinion about what Grant says. Grant says he was told to march directly to the battlefield. Wallace says he's supposed to take a certain road. Who knows who's right? Wallace doesn't perform very well regardless. He doesn't get there all day until nightfall. He's only marching, 5 or 6 miles. He gets lost. you would think that you would have done a reconnaissance to Pittsburgh Landing, where the main army was, in advance to know where you would have to go in case you had to march there, but apparently he didn't. Once Grant arrives, he goes and meets his division commanders, tells them to hold on. Wallace is on the way. Buell's army is on the way. Oh, also before Grant leaves Savannah, the 1st Division of Buell's army had arrived the night before. And Grant tells that division, Nelson's division, to march opposite Pittsburgh Landing, and his troops will be ferried across. So Grant tells him, hold on, help is on the way. He had noticed at Fort Donelson that ammunition began to run short. So he orders ammunition from the rear sent to the front right away to keep up a supply so they don't run out during the fighting. So about the same time on the left, this is kind of the area we're going to be looking at. This is the Shiloh Church sector. This is commanded by Sherman. And both troops from both the 1st and 2nd rank end up getting commingled and attacking Sherman. Sherman's position around Shiloh Church is pretty strong. It's on the top of a hill. A creek runs through here, Shiloh Branch, and the land around the creek itself is pretty swampy. It's still swampy today, but Sherman is up on a high ground. So the attackers have to go through this low ground, swampy ground, cross the creek, and it's springtime, so it's swampier than usual. And then they have to climb a hill to attack the Union position. And the hill's pretty steep. Claiborne attacks first. He drives off one of Grant's regiments in the middle of Ray's field, and then he turns to attack Buckland's brigade up this hill, and he attacks unsupported. He's in this low ground, and he's not going to make any progress. This is just one brigade, and this is one brigade, but he doesn't stand a chance because, like I said, this is high ground. It's covered with artillery. They're going through this low ground, and Claiborne's brigade is basically wrecked. But eventually, you see all these Confederate units begin to converge on that Shiloh Church sector. Sherman has 3 brigades there, 8,000 men, but the Confederates have close to 10 brigades that are attacking, and eventually Sherman is driven from that Shiloh Church sector to the Hamburg-Purdy Road, where they use the road basically to form a new position. And this is it's not in the creek bed. It's basically a flat area. It's not defensible terrain. They just form there because it's easy to form on the road. And the Confederates, with this huge attack, drive the Federals almost a mile north up into Jones Field, where they attempt to reorganize. And the Confederates, the attack is temporarily culminated. They've run out of combat power, and they pause to reorganize as well. But if you look at this map, so what's the Confederate objective? It's to drive the Federals away from Pittsburgh Landing. At this point, are they driving them away from Pittsburgh Landing? No, they're starting to drive the Federals to Pittsburgh Landing.
Across it looks like 3-mile front, Doug?
Yeah.
3 miles.
But Shiloh is an incredibly huge and complex battle. I mean, there's really 3 or 4 battles going on at any one time. You can we're dividing it up into kind of sectors, but it's extremely confusing, very large. Anybody have ever been there? Very large battlefield.
If you notice that, if you take the image of a sand clock, it kind of gives you the idea of what it was like. There was that narrow plateau in the center, and then that's why they had difficulties on the left and right flanks. And then Johnson decided, he actually thought that they were pushing them to the left.
So the Union retreats back to the main Corinth Road and the Hamburg-Savannah Road. McClernand, his division was behind, his camp was behind Sherman. So after Sherman begins to retreat, McClernand comes forward on his own initiative and lines his troops up along the main Corinth Road. The Confederates reorganize, and you can see how much more combat power they have at this point than the Federals do. And the Federals are bloodied, and they're fighting on non-defensible terrain. The 4th Tennessee here is asked by their brigade commander if they can silence McAllister's battery right here, which is causing trouble in the Confederate lines. The commander says, "We'll try." So the 4th Tennessee on their own marches across this open field, takes some casualties, slips into the woods, and then boom, pops out right in front of that battery and destroys it. And it basically unhinges the left flank of McClernand, and they retreat. Eventually the Confederates launch a massive assault, and they drive Sherman and McClernand all the way up to Jones Field, about a mile north of their position. This is kind of the same slide showing their retreat north.
Were Sherman and McClernand, were they arguing at that time?
No, they were pretty good at that time. McClernand hadn't gotten stupid yet. So these guys all retreat up into Jones Field, about a mile north. And there they reorganize. Like I said before, the Confederates, that attack is kind of culminated. They've run out of power. They need to reorganize. They've looted Union camps. They're just kind of all mixed up. And you can see now all those troops, they're not in 3 lines anymore. Now they're all mixed up. So eventually the Confederates come up with kind of a makeshift command. Breckinridge takes the right, then Bragg, then Polk, and then Hardee. And they actually began fighting in sectors like they should have done in the first place. So like this slide says, the Confederates are now massing on the left. They're not supposed to be massing on the left until they've achieved their objective on the right. So these guys are up here in Jones Field, and they're left alone. Sherman and McClernand are left alone for an hour or so. And when you're attacked and you survive the attack, what do you do next?
Reorganize, replenish ammo, evacuate your casualties, get water.
And counterattack.
Well, you gotta do all that stuff first.
Okay. But they've done that, and then they counterattack. At about noon, which is really an impressive feat, one of the most important actions at Shiloh from the Union perspective, they attack. After they had the daylights kicked out of them all morning long, they counterattack. And they drive the Confederates south all the way back down here to Wolf Field. So they drive them back about a half mile. So what they've done is they're going to start trading space for time, because now they've extended the battlefield a half mile to the front. They've bought themselves a half mile of ground, and it's going to take the Confederates now more time to drive them to the north. So if we return to the right, when the Confederates overrun Prentice's brigade, they think that they have turned the Union left flank. Actually, they've hit the middle of the Union Army. Hurlbut's brigade is camped up here. I'm sorry, Hurlbut's division is camped up here. And that one brigade that Sherman sends over here to guard this road, the Hamburg-Savannah Road, it's sitting there, and a staff officer, one of General Johnston's staff officers, Samuel Lockett, he sees this brigade over here that's not supposed to be there, and he tells the general that there's a Union division. He, as usually happens in the Civil War, he overestimates the size of the unit. It's actually a single brigade of 3 regiments, probably only about 2,000 soldiers at the most, commanded by David Stewart. And so Johnson makes the decision at this point that he's going to commit 2 brigades of his reserve. The reserve is held until the critical point in time in the battle. So here it is, mid-morning, and Johnston has already committed 2/3 of his reserve. Because he obviously believes that this is the critical place and time in the battle. So the Confederates shift 2 brigades that have been involved in the fighting over here against Prentiss, shift them to the right to attack Stuart, and then they send these 2 other brigades from the reserve to attack over here. Stuart is way outnumbered. When those Confederates begin attacking up this road, he retreats to another position. Unfortunately, you don't see it on this map, but there is a ravine behind this position, and it's very steep. And when they're attacked again, they retreat, and you never defend with an obstacle or a danger area behind you. And he did. His brigade really got cut to pieces because they're in a very low ravine, and the Confederates were basically just shooting down on them. So his brigade is driven from the field, but it has caused the commitment of 2 brigades from the reserve and the movement of 2 other brigades to deal with him. So he has taken up, once again, this has taken up more time than the Confederates can afford. This is supposed to be a quick attack, but all this stuff is slowing down the Confederate movement, and they are making progress, but it's taken a while. So I talked about Hurlbut's brigade, or division. He's camped up here in Cloud Field. When he hears fighting, he moves to the front, and he positions his 2 of his brigades around this old cotton field and peach orchard. You probably heard of the peach orchard at Shiloh. And he positions another one on the other side of this road. And they take up a defensive position. So once Stuart is defeated down here, the Confederates then move to attack the next Union position, which is Hurlbut's brigade right in here. They launch several attacks against that position, and they cannot be convinced to attack any farther. Finally, General Breckinridge, who is kind of in control of this area, he approaches General Johnston, who happens to come on the scene, and he tells General Johnston that he can't get these Tennessee troops to attack. With Johnston is Isham Harris, the governor of Tennessee, who was serving as a volunteer aide. And so Governor Harris goes and talks to the troops. Johnston decides that he's going to lead an attack. And so maybe around 1:30 or so, Johnston personally leads an attack on this Union position. Johnston at this time is the 2nd highest ranking officer in the Confederate Army. He's one of 5 full 4-star generals. Only the Adjutant General of the Confederacy, Samuel Cooper, has a higher rank. So Johnston goes out, he leads this attack. A short while out, and these guys eventually these guys are driven from the field, and the road to Pittsburgh Landing is wide open. Shortly after the attack, Johnston is sitting on his horse. He's approached by a staff officer. He doesn't look good. He eventually kind of reels in the saddle. The officer grabs him and says, "General Johnston, who you injured?" And Johnston's last words were, "Yes, and I fear seriously." They basically get him down from the horse, carry him to a safe place, and a few minutes later he dies from loss of blood. He was hit by an artery in the back of his leg. His sciatic nerve there had been damaged, and he doesn't have any feeling in that leg. He probably didn't even know he was hit. He had a tourniquet in his pocket, which could have saved his life. His personal doctor he sent away earlier to treat wounded soldiers. So Johnston is dead, and there is a lull on this part of the battlefield. Whether that's because, you hear different things, whether that's because Johnston dies and nobody takes control, or it's just a result of the Confederates being confused after they've taken this hard position. But the road to Pittsburgh Landing is now wide open, but these guys here are not doing anything for a long time.
For years, there was a tree that allegedly, marked where Albert Sidney Johnston was hit. Well, Albert Sidney Johnston himself doesn't know where he was hit. So how is there a tree on the battlefield,
That's been debunked, like you said.
Yeah.
It's been debunked. The person who identified where Johnston was found under that tree and where he was led to where he bled to death, this was many years after the battle. And I think they know about where it was based on what was happening, but it wasn't. If you go to the battlefield, it's not where they tell you at the battlefield.
And the tree's dead now, so.
And the tree's dead, and they'll
Yeah.
tell you it wasn't the spot.
Yeah.
Was that the Hornets nest there where Hurlbut was?
No. We're going to talk about the Hornet's Nest now. Hurlbut's position touched what's going to eventually become a Hornet's Nest. When Prentice's brigade is routed, division is routed, they retreated back about a mile or so, and Prentice rallied a few hundred of his own troops. And in addition, division commanded by William Wallace, on their own initiative, moves from the rear to the front and hooks up with Prentice. And they attach to Hurlbut, and so that's what forms the line. But now, these guys here, from here over, these guys are now gone. And what's going to become the Hornet's Nest will be from here on over. So here's the peach orchard, the open field. This is the road to Pittsburgh Landing. And we're going to look at how the Hornet's Nest forms. The Hornet's Nest, which probably everybody's heard of, is the area kind of in the center of the Union line. These are Sherman's and McClernand's guys. So you can see how at one time they had this nice long line. Sherman and McClernand are defeated, and now Hurlbut is defeated. And what you're going to have here is just these troops remaining. But at one time, that was a solid line. There's William Wallace. During the battle, his wife had come down before the battle started. He's ready to go. He knows she's here. He's going down to go see her, and the battle starts over. And she spends the whole battle helping take care of wounded soldiers at Pittsburgh Landing. This line takes up a position on what they call the sunken road. There really is no sunken road at Shiloh. It's another one of you should do the myths of Shiloh. This is another myth of the Battle of Shiloh. There was no sunken road. There was a road that went through there. Maybe it was a few inches deep, a wagon, a farm road or whatever. But whatever it was enough for these Union troops to form a position on. The biggest reason that this is a successful position, not because it's a sunken road, because there's a lot of Union troops in there. If you walk down the sunken road today, I mean, there's just plaque after plaque after plaque of regiment after regiment that are like right next to each other. There's a lot of troops there with a little bit of artillery, and it's a very strong position. The Confederates, estimates vary, but there are probably about 7 different attacks on that position, the Hornet's Nest position. And the problem was they're brigade-sized attacks. So you only have a couple thousand men attacking at any given time, a very strong position. So each one is defeated in detail. General Bragg is in charge of this area, and he is asked repeatedly for artillery support and for more units to help on an attack, but he just simply orders attack after attack. And each one is defeated easily. None of them come close to breaking that position. This is a picture of Colonel Randall Gibson. His brigade attacked several times and was just shot to pieces. After the battle, he falls out of favor with Bragg, who thinks he's a coward and didn't attack well enough, and it really hurt his career. Really unfair of Bragg. So these guys, Sherman and McClernand retreat, Hurlbut retreats. The Confederates finally, after a while, these guys had been not doing anything for a while, eventually they start moving forward. But instead of going to Pittsburgh Landing, they get sucked into the fighting in the Hornet's Nest. These guys over here, they get sucked into fighting in the Hornet's Nest. And where is it? Trebaux's brigade. Trebaux, that's the last brigade in the reserve. Johnston commits it up here to the fight. So the Hornet's Nest is, instead of the Confederates attacking Pittsburgh Landing, they're all being sucked into the center to attack and reduce the Hornet's Nest. General Bowen there. He, of course, was a St. Louis guy. In the afternoon, Francis Shoup, who's chief of artillery on, I forget whose staff he was even on. But anyways, he's a division chief of artillery. He begins collecting artillery pieces and putting them opposite the Hornet's Nest so they can try and reduce the Hornet's Nest by artillery fire. I believe he and a guy named Daniel Ruggles, who was a division commander, together they assembled 53 artillery pieces. The legend is 62. Shiloh will tell you it's 53. Anyway, it's a lot, the most ever seen on the North American continent. 53 artillery pieces, and they begin bombarding the Hornet's Nest. Now what that does is it doesn't destroy the Hornet's Nest, but what it does, it isolates that position. These guys can't move, they can't retreat when they're under tremendous artillery fire. So it keeps those guys in place and keeps them from retreating, and you can see eventually all these Confederates that were fighting here, they begin moving around the rear. They're not attacking Pittsburgh Landing. They're moving around to the rear, and they're going to surround the Hornet's Nest. Kind of the same picture. That monument is to the 14th Iowa. Anybody remember the 14th Iowa? Pilot Knob, heroes of Pilot Knob. They were captured in the Hornet's Nest. They were some studs, man. So this is a picture of how that position collapses and is eventually captured by the Confederates. It's getting dark. This guy here is Joseph Webster at the time. He is Grant's chief of staff. During the day, he has collected every single piece of field artillery, and they have some mobile siege artillery. And he begins building up a line to protect Pittsburgh Landing in case worse comes to worse, and they have to make a last stand. He also takes every unit that he can get, every body that he can get. They're milling around Pittsburgh Landing by the thousands, scared troops. He organizes them and moves them up to a line. And he begins building up a line to protect Pittsburgh Landing in case worse comes to worse, and they have to make a last stand. He also takes every unit that he can get, every body that he can get. They're milling around Pittsburgh Landing by the thousands, scared troops. He organizes them and moves them up to a line defending Pittsburgh Landing, which is the lifeline, of course, of the Union Army. Nelson's division from Buell's Army of the Ohio arrives. They take up a position on the landing, and so by the end of the day, by 5 o'clock in the afternoon, this is a very strong position. Dozens of artillery pieces there, some really big 32-pound mobile siege guns, thousands of troops. The Confederates make one final push down Dill Branch Ravine, which is, I mean, it's a really, ravine is the right word. It's very, very steep and high. One last attack through this ravine, up this very steep hill. That attack is shot to pieces, and that's it for the day. The Confederate attack is completely culminated. The Union soldiers that are not captured or dead are back in this very, very strong last line, and that's how the battle ends for the day. You can see all these different units. It's not that neat. There are individual soldiers all over the place that have lost their units, but it gives you an idea of how many soldiers Grant has in this last line. So the Federals have been brutalized, but they're still alive. They occupy a strong position around Pittsburgh Landing. Lew Wallace's division, which is lost during the day, comes in and takes up a position on the far Union right. 15,000 of Buell's men arrive during the night. However, there is no coordination between Grant and Buell. They don't like each other. Grant thinks Buell's a jerk, and Buell thinks the Army of the Tennessee has been defeated, and he has to save the day. He has no confidence, no faith in the Union Army or Grant.
So these fresh troops, they're coming off the boats that are coming down the river?
They march. They've been marching from the opposite side of the river from Kentucky. They arrive opposite the landing, and then they get on steamboats and they're transported. Those steamboats can hold, my goodness, they can hold hundreds of people at a time. So they just shuttle them back and forth all night.
Oh my gosh, from Kentucky?
Yeah, they've been marching for weeks. Actually, probably, well, they started in February. So they
knew what they were going into?
Yeah, Halleck had ordered them to march to join him there. That was Savannah was the rendezvous point. So they'd been marching towards Savannah, which is like 8 miles upstream or downstream from Pittsburgh Landing. The Confederates, their entire army withdrew from the front. There were no troops that were anywhere within a mile of the Union position when nightfall. In fact, Polk's corps withdrew all the way back to their camps the night before, which was not even on the battlefield. So they're kind of like Pilot Knob. They just simply withdrew. They thought they had won. Once again, they thought they had won. So they retreat from the battlefield. Confusion in the Confederate Army. They're probably more confused than the Union Army by victory, because their troops are all spread out all over the place, all over this massive battlefield. Doesn't sound good. Massive battle, 3 miles long and a couple of miles deep. Commands and units are separated from each other. They've suffered thousands and thousands of casualties. They got one regiment of reinforcements, about 300 or 400 soldiers during the night, and that was it. Prentiss is the guest of General Beauregard at his army headquarters. Buell brags that Nelson will arrive during the night, and the tide will turn the next day. Beauregard doesn't believe it. Confederate scouts say that Beauregard is on the Duck River 100 miles away from, or I should say Buell's 100 miles away, and will not arrive in time. Beauregard prematurely, and this, if he had not done this thing, his reputation and career would have probably gone a lot better. But Beauregard wires Richmond and says, "I've won a great victory." He sends a messenger back to Corinth, and that's a little premature. The Union gunboats fire on the Confederates all night, keeping them awake, basically harassing them all night.
The river was much higher then,
Higher, yes.
because there, you know, you've heard of this thing called the Tennessee Valley Authority, hence the Tennessee River. I don't know if you made that connection, but they've built a dam upstream since then. But those boats actually got up into Dill Branch a couple hundred yards and had a really wide arc of fire into the Confederate position. So you can't tell that today. And the road runs through there as you're coming back the backside at the end of the auto tour, and you go down, you kind of feel it, but it was flooded.
Yeah.
So they had a really good, I hate to talk about Navy stuff, but I guess we have to. So, and basically it just harassed them all night, kept them awake, and I don't know if it caused many casualties, but it sure irritated them when it was already a bad situation.
Yeah, it was more psychological warfare than anything else.
Big guns.
So here's a map of Lew Wallace's Odyssey. He's up here at Crump's Landing. He's supposed to take the river road, which is only, what, 5 or 6 miles? Instead, he goes out on this road, the Shunpike. One of Grant's staff officers finds him, tells him he's going the wrong way. He fools around for a while, they eat, he backtracks, and then comes down here and doesn't get there until after dark. This ruins Lew Wallace's, what had been a very promising career. It basically ruins his career. During the night, this is an actual live action photo of General Nathan Bedford Forrest on what is now called Mound Number 1 at the Shiloh Mound Group. And he sees, from there he can see the Confederate or the Union transports coming. So he finds General Hardee, wakes him up, tells him there's reinforcements, we got to attack, you got to be prepared. Hardee says, okay, go scout some more. And he does, he comes back and wakes up Hardee again. Hardee says, okay, great, go scout some more. And Confederates, they literally don't do anything during the night. Both the Army of the Ohio and the Army of the Tennessee attack at first light. It's kind of, Buell and Grant didn't meet, but both commanders kind of knew that they're going to attack at first light. Grant's army is on this side. Buell is on the Union left. And both of it, Grant's army runs into troops maybe a half mile or so from the front, cavalry. Buell's army marches, I mean, my goodness, they march 2 miles before they hit any kind of resistance at all. Once the Confederates realize that there is an attack on their position, they begin to rush troops north as soon as they can to meet that. But they just don't have enough combat power at this point. They've had so many casualties. People are not coming to the front. They're separated from their commands. And the Union Army now has massive firepower, massive combat power, and they're able to drive them south. Even though the Confederates, at least in Buell's front, the Confederates put up a very, very stiff resistance. By noon, Buell's attack is completely stalled. Even though he has overwhelming power in that area, Grant, even though he met his guys closer to the front, he has an easier time pushing the Confederate left wing back. The Confederates decide, once the battle stalls, they decide they're going to counterattack, which was a good plan. But they simply don't have enough power, and Buell's able to hold them off, and they retreat. As the afternoon wears on, Grant continues to be able to push the Confederates. He's pushed them by noon or so. He's pushed them a couple miles from where he first encountered them up in Jones Field. Beauregard's headquarters is down here at Shiloh. Oh, it's where Sherman's old headquarters was, just north of Shiloh Church. Beauregard's headquarters is threatened, so he has to relocate. Now the Confederates on the left. This is where the Union counterattack kind of ended yesterday. The Confederates try the same thing, but once again, they simply don't have enough power to drive the Union Army from the field. You see the overall map. Once again, you're kind of fighting two battles. Buell over here, either meeting much stiffer resistance, or his troops just not as good. Grant's troops having a much easier time on their flank. Afternoon, the Confederates finally retreat, even though they put up a stiff resistance. And about 3 p.m., or by 3 p.m., they've completely abandoned the battlefield. Beauregard makes the decision around noon or so that there's nothing they can do to hold off the Union Army. And they're right, at this point, they simply don't have the power. They're too disorganized. They're too much outnumbered. So Beauregard makes the difficult decision to withdraw from the battlefield. The Federals don't pursue immediately. Eventually, Sherman sends a detachment out to pursue them. They run into a cavalry detachment under Nathan Bedford Forrest at a place called Fallen Timbers, just a couple miles south of the battlefield. Forrest's men just whip the daylights out of this Union detachment. Forrest, adding to the Forrest legend, allegedly Forrest rides forward. He grabs a Union soldier off the ground, uses him as a shield, and rides off the battlefield. So the Confederates make it back to Corinth, basically untouched. The only pursuit, like I said, was easily shattered by the Confederates. The casualties at Shiloh were staggering. You've probably heard before. The casualties at Shiloh were greater than all American war, than the Revolution, the War of 1812, and the Mexican War combined. Staggering casualties. Beauregard, who had been, at least publicly, his star was in the ascent, even though he and Davis were not getting along, and he had been banished to the west after Shiloh because he took over what was perceived as a winning battle and then lost it, and then said he'd won it when they actually hadn't. His star is definitely in the descent, and Beauregard never recovers. His career never recovers. Halleck finally arrives to assume command of the two armies. Grant is made second in command of this army group. Grant comes under tremendous criticism from the North. Nobody had thought about casualties like these before. Well, they thought, a lot of people, including Grant, thought Shiloh would be the last battle. After the Confederates' terrible performance at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, a lot of folks, including Grant, thought this is it, one more push. We capture Corinth or smoke them in northern Mississippi, and they're done for. But obviously, nobody expected what happened at Shiloh. Grant's career is temporarily sidelined, although he eventually comes back. Lew Wallace's career is wrecked. Prentiss becomes a hero in the North because he stayed on the battlefield. He only had a few hundred troops of his in the Hornet's Nest, but to his credit, he didn't retreat back to Pittsburgh Landing. If he had, it probably would have ended his career. But he stayed on the battlefield, was captured, went into captivity, and even though his incompetence led to the disaster at the beginning of the battle, he actually comes out kind of a hero. Yeah.
Yeah, on two things. On one, obviously, Prentiss was really a scallywag, in the sense of he didn't listen to Peabody.
Well, he was a scallywag anyway, kind of.
Yeah, but Lew Wallace, it's interesting that, you know, this came out after the war, obviously, but, you know, his flanking maneuvers was part of the reason for the Confederate retreating on the left. Although they, you know, the other debate was, well, you're being a coward, you won't engage your troops. But he kept flanking them, coming around and forcing them to retreat, which was very effective, actually. So he was actually a very effective officer on the second day.
Yeah, Lew Wallace was a pretty decent officer, but because he got, you know, on the wrong side of the guy who eventually was the commander in chief, it really hurt his career. And I mean, he didn't do well. Even he should have known the direct route. Now, another thing is, what would have happened on day one if Lew Wallace arrives on the right flank and he could have turned the tide of the battle in the Union's favor that first day. If he arrives mid-afternoon or so, early afternoon, he could have flanked the Confederates, and it could have been a whole different battle. Halleck joins the army, and then he launches a campaign that eventually captures the city of Corinth, and we'll talk about that next month, which I'm excited about because I don't know a lot about it, quite frankly. The Southern writer, George Washington Cable, he's not Civil War, he's after the Civil War, but he, in one of his novels, he's a novelist, in one of his novels, he says, the South never smiled again after Shiloh. Which, yeah, Shiloh was, if Forts Henry and Donelson were bad, Shiloh was devastating. Shiloh was the Confederates' big chance to completely reverse the strategic situation in the Western Theater after Forts Henry and Donelson. And it was a good try, but it failed. There were they made a lot of mistakes. Usually in the Civil War, a genius doesn't win, it's the guys who make the least amount of mistakes. And the Union made a bunch of mistakes, but the Confederates made more. The plan was bad, the reconnaissance was bad, their understanding of the situation was bad. Had Johnston known that Pittsburgh Landing was 2 miles from the Union left flank, things might have turned out different. But
And he gets himself killed.
But the commanders had to, they had to fight the battle based on what they knew, and what they knew, some of that information was incorrect. Yes?
It might be pointed out that because of that 2-day delay in the beginning, and Grant's troops learning more about the Confederates, Beauregard actually advised Johnson not to attack.
Yes, he did. Beauregard advised, in fact, most of the senior Confederate officers advised Johnston not to attack. And Johnston said, I would attack if they were 1,000,000. Talking about the delay, if he had attacked 2 days prior, Buell would not have been there. Now, the Grant people will tell you it didn't make any difference. Grant would have won anyway, which he probably would have, but it would have been not maybe as decisive as it was on the second day. And then, of course, the Buell supporters will say, well, Grant would have been destroyed if Buell didn't arrive. But yeah, it would have definitely been a different battle.
I think a lot of people in the South believe that Buell had actually saved Grant.
They do, and a lot of people in the South believe that Johnston's death really was the turning point in the battle. I don't know that I believe of the terrain kind of doomed the attack from the start. But you never know. I mean, if Johnston would have pushed, if he could have pushed those troops farther to Pittsburgh Landing instead of being a lull in the battle, that would have made a difference. But I don't know. I think that was much of a result of just the attack culminated. We're disorganized. We're tired. We're hungry. It just kind of stalled. But you never know. Yes.
So what year is this?
1862.
62.
Yes.
Okay. So they still got a lot more fighting to do.
We got a lot more fighting to do. Yeah. Yes.
Doug,
Yes.
this battlefield extended over thousands of acres. What was the civilian population before this engagement? How did they fare, get out of the area before all this proceeded?
Civilian population was very small. We're in the middle of nowhere. I mean, still today, it's pretty far in the country today. But it was literally a wilderness at that time. You had, so if you look at this map, basically what you have is farms of 50 acres, maybe 30 acres, 30, 50 acre farms, and log cabins. That's it. There aren't towns.
So maybe a few hundred people over all that acreage at most.
Yeah.
Probably more like 100.
Yeah.
There weren't many people there.
Enough for
The-
a church.
Enough for a church, yeah. The effect on the civilian population was really not very great. If you look at the pictures of the Shiloh battlefield 50, 60, 80 years later, it's not changed much.
And my second question, this wasn't clear until your closing slide about the casualties and so forth, including the capture. How were prisoners handled by both sides during the course of the two days?
Sent to the rear, most of them.
Yeah, they go to the rear. I don't know. They would have had the pre-runner of the military police, they would have had a provost, a provost marshal, and a provost guard, whose job it was to take troops from the front line to the rear and then hold them in the rear. Now, what actually the procedures were at Shiloh, I can't tell you.
I know that I've read that when the guys that they took out of the Peace Guard, they were marched back to Corinth almost the same day.
Yeah, the Union troops, the Union prisoners were marched back to Corinth. Yeah, they got them out of there pretty quick. I don't know where the prisoners from Shiloh ended up.
A lot of the officers ended up back in Virginia, in the prison camp in Virginia. Now the prisoners, they were, at the time, they still were doing it, where if you capture so many, you could exchange the prisoners, so.
Right. Like the 14th Iowa, I know a little bit about them because I've researched them. They were in prison for about 6 months, and then they were exchanged.
So was the 21st Missouri. That was one of the units acquired. I've got a book I hold on the 21st.
21st was a detachment of them was one of the ones that was on the dawn patrol. Well, there were 2 dawn patrols. They were on the second one.
Yeah.
So yeah, Missourians started the Battle of Shiloh.
If I can
Yes.
add a personal comment here, my maternal great-great-grandfather and his brother were both with Sterling Wood during this campaign. Made the march back to Corinth. They both survived the war, but they went over into Alabama, Mississippi, ended up defending Atlanta. In his obituary in 1912, it says, "One thing that will be of great consolation to his children and later descendants is the volume he wrote about his and his brother's service to the Confederacy." We've never found
Oh
it.
no! Oh man,
We know he wrote it, but we've never been able to find it.
that would be awesome to find that.
Yeah.
I was, as a young captain, I was teaching officer candidate school, and I took 3 rotations for staff riders at Shiloh. One of my students, her whatever great-great-grandfather was with the 16th Wisconsin, and he was a doctor, she had his memoirs of the Civil War, which were they had been in Savannah, and they were shipped during the first day, they were shipped upstream to fight, and he talks about how nervous they were you can imagine, you've never been in combat before, and there's this roar of battle up ahead, and you're heading to it, so you can see how. I wish I would have kept a copy of it. I gave it to Stacy Allen, the head historian at Shiloh. I didn't keep a copy for myself, though. Yeah.
One quick commentary on Buell, you mentioned he didn't make quite the headway on day 2 that Grant did. But it's just in reverse of what Johnston did. Johnston's left swept all the way around, and his right didn't. Well, why? Well, because all those creeks are getting deeper and deeper as they empty into the Tennessee. It's terrain dictated. It's not it's great terrain for defense on the eastern half of the battlefield, and great terrain for offense on the western half of the battlefield. So that's tableland to the west. So Grant, Sherman and Lew Wallace, they can sweep around pretty easily because it's pretty flat. There's no great place for the Confederates to make a stand. But for Buell, Confederates make a stand in the same place that they'd made a stand the day before. And so before we were too hard on poor Buell, it was mostly terrain dictated.
I don't like Buell.
Well, I'm not a fan, but credit where credit's due.
Tillman Branch up here is a very, very steep ravine. But once you get by that, you go all the way down to Shiloh Branch.
Yeah.
Where's Shiloh?
Further south and west. There
All
you
the
go.
way down to Shiloh Branch. And this is level ground. There's defense there would be very, very difficult.
I managed to get to Shiloh many years ago when I got a apartment. And then we went on the last tour with the guide, one of the rangers, and he took us to one of those valleys, and he talked about the guys climbing up the hill with the slick shoes on, didn't have the fancy track shoes like a lot of us wear nowadays. And he said they made quite a, and then they came up and then they saw all the large guns sitting that Grant had lined up along.
You're probably talking about Dill Branch.
Yeah.
There it is. It's incredibly steep, and those shoes are not made for hiking. You see a lot of soldiers. Well, most of them would put like a horseshoe on the heel with leather bottoms, and a lot of them would put like tacks in the bottom of them to get a little bit of traction, which I'm sure we'll all hear all about during your presentation later on. All accoutrements from the common soldier. Any other questions? If any of you, let's see, Steve, you want to go on the Little Civil War Roundtable on Thursday?
Yes.
So Ben goes to Little Civil War Roundtable. It's run by the Civil War Roundtable of St. Louis. It's free. It's noon or 11?
11 o'clock.
What? 11 o'clock. If anybody wants to go, let me know, because you really need to make arrangements. The first time I went, a bunch of us just showed up. I think they had planned for like 11, and 20 showed up, and the waitresses were not happy, and let everybody know they were not happy, that they had to wait on a whole lot more people. So
if you have anybody going, you need to let Sid Canstolder know.
yeah, I will.
Keeps track of the number.
Yeah, I'll do it. I'm gonna do it tomorrow morning. I haven't received an email from him. I wrote to be on this list, but I didn't get one last month. I haven't gotten one so far, but I'll email him for Steve and I.
Yeah, maybe Thursday.
Yeah. If anybody else interested in going? Okay.
I just gotta get healthy.
Yep. All right.
Thank you, Doug.
You betcha.